You've just entered the law offices of Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker. If you've come for actual legal advice, you need to turn right around, honey. You need to get out of here, 'cause you ain't gonna get none of that. They quibble, and they squabble, and they bicker. But if you want to hear meaningless opinions, this is the right place. They got plenty of that. Stuff that makes no sense at all. They go off on tangents. It's crazy talk. If that's your thing, keep listening. They'll keep talking.
Oh no no, oh no no, it's another episode of the law offices of Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker. You've entered the law offices of Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker. Yay!
Welcome to another episode of the Law Offices of Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker on this April 24th, 2021. We have a treat for all of you out there. We have the inimitable and indefatigable yet indeterminate author, philosopher, Howard Bloom, also a former A-list publicist of Prince and Michael Jackson and Chaka Khan back in the 80s. And he's decided to grace us with his presence today. We'll be discussing one of his more recent books. He's written about 7, I believe, at this stage.
Yes, 7, you got it.
Yeah, and then later on, he'll help us as a guest fake attorney for our client, our dog's best friend. All right, so my first question is, you say you're the philosopher at the end of the universe. Are you suggesting that the universe is ending right now? And what proof do you have of that?
Well, actually, okay. Look, there is a serious thing here. It was Gear magazine that called me the philosopher at the end of the universe. Bless their souls. It's a nice idea. Like, it goes back to Douglas Adams.
That's what I thought. It was like Hitchhiker's Guide reference.
Right,
so,
and his comedy series. But when I was 16 years old, I've been in science since I was 10 years old. I got it started in microbiology and theoretical physics at the age of 10. And when I was 16, I was working at the world's largest cancer research facility, the Roswell Park Cancer Memorial Research Lab.
Like as a
Buffalo,
test subject, or?
No, it would have been interesting, but no, I was working as a lab assistant.
Okay, so they weren't like testing new cancer cells on you.
No, I was fortunately doing that on poor innocent bunny rabbits. And you know, what could be more dolorous? What could be sadder than injecting 300 guinea or in this case, rabbits a day with toxic substances in their ears? But so at any rate, I came up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe. It took me the whole summer to do it. And it predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for another 38 years called dark energy. And that theory does predict, by the way, so I threw it away because after all, when you're 16, it's got to be comic book science, right? No matter how many years you've spent in science at that point. So I tossed the whole thing away. And then in 1998, they discovered something the theory had predicted, which is called dark energy. It's that galaxies at a certain point in the universe start running away from each other. They start accelerating away from each other like a Porsche with your foot all the way down on the pedal. And this theory not only predicted that, but it explained why it happens. So I was forced to resurrect the theory. And according to most theories, the universe is going to end in 100 billion years or 100 trillion years or something like that. According to this theory, the universe is going to end in about 2.5 to 3.5 billion years. So if you have anything important to do,
yes,
try to get it done in the next 2 billion years.
I'll get my affairs in order.
You know, Greg is our expert on comic book science. Greg, would you agree with this particular assessment?
Well, Superman might disagree, but Batman, I think he concurs with this theory.
Batman does. Okay.
Well,
yeah, Batman.
What about Brainiac? Does Brainiac get involved in this theoretical reasoning at all?
He has his own crazy theories I don't want to get into.
Okay.
Probably best.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk this through the evolution of Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, the most recent book that was published last year, I believe, around this time. Yes. So it's like almost the anniversary of the.
You got it. April 15th, it was published. So Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me. When I was 12 years old, okay, see if this experience sounds at all familiar. When I was 12 years old, I realized I was an atheist. I could not confess that to myself. There was a very simple reason. I had a party coming up. It was going to be the first party I was ever going to be invited to in Buffalo, New York. Other kids didn't like me. My parents didn't have time for me. I was pretty much a loner most of the time. And if I confessed that I was an atheist, the party would be canceled.
Yeah, I
Plus
had a bar
all
mitzvah.
the
I understand
presents.
you.
Yes, it was my bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
So you know how you sometimes take something that you know, but you shove it off to a closet in the corner of your mind as if it doesn't exist. And you pretend it doesn't exist, even to yourself. So I pretended I still believed in God. I went on stage for the bar mitzvah. I had the party. The other kids who never wanted to have anything to do with me didn't have anything to do with me at my own party either. So what else is new? And then I cashed all of the checks and packed away all of the presents and wrote all of the thank you notes. And then at the end of the summer, I was free to confess something to myself. I'm an atheist. Okay.
You know, I never actually, I think I never got done writing the thank you notes after my bar mitzvah.
Oh my
And
God.
it was a bad thing. And I didn't come to your conclusion. I never admitted myself to being atheist, but I became like a militant agnostic in my late teens, early 20s. So you beat me by a few years when I came to my family and I went, I'm not practicing Judaism anymore.
You were a bar mitzvah poser.
Well, so here's what happens. So it's the end
mitzvah.
of August when I finish writing all these thank you notes. Guess what comes up at the beginning of September? The high holidays.
Yes.
Now, my parents were not observant and they didn't go to temple unless it was a friend's son's wedding or something like that. But when it comes to the high holidays, these are absolutes. You must go or you will fry in hell, even if hell is not in the Jewish religion.
It's like Catholics only go to church for Christmas Mass or for Easter or whatever,
right.
right?
So my parents,
I was gonna say I had an Irish bar mitzvah, which meant my mom got me a 6-pack of beer and a pack of cigarettes, and no one came and no one cared.
So at any rate, my parents get me into a suit, which is nigh unto impossible. I hate suits. And they get me all the way in their blue Fraser 4-door automobile to Richmond Avenue, where the temple is. And at that point, I refused to go any further. And then my parents are trying to drag me out of the car, literally by my ankles. This is not an exaggeration.
So you're like 13? You're like 13
was,
years old?
I'm 13, yes.
Okay.
So I'm holding on to the door frame, you know, the sturdy American-made door frame with both hands. And I have a sudden insight. Since I'm an atheist, there are no gods beneath the ground and there are no gods up in the skies. But there are gods in this picture. Where are they? They're in the incredible passion with which my parents are willing to drag their firstborn son up the street, face down on the cement, thus turning my face into a hamburger for the rest of my life. They believe so powerfully in whatever it is they're about to drag me to.
So the god inside them was like Vulcan or Thor because of the nature of the violence they were putting upon you. Okay.
And so I suddenly realized if there are no gods, no gods in the heaven, no gods below the ground. So the gods are in my parents in this incredible passion that they're manifesting right now. And if those gods exist in my parents' passions, then those passions exist inside of me. So my two heroes, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, he took a lens and he turned it down a pond water and he saw microscopic animals for the first time ever. And another hero of mine, Galileo, took two lenses and he pointed them up at the sky and he saw that whereas everything was supposed to be perfection, it was God's underwear and you were not supposed to look up there. It was big.
You're looking up God's skirt, is what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And what did he see up there? He saw, great balls of fire. No, he saw big, chunky balls of stone, for God's sake. And
God has balls of stone?
Yes. So one of them had turned the lenses up. Yeah, God has stone balls. So one of them had turned the lens up. One of them had turned the lens down. So I realized my job was to turn the lens inside and find the gods inside of us. So we'll skip forward many, many, many years after I had accidentally helped found the hippie movement and a bunch of other ridiculous adventures. And I went back to college and I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with 4 fellowships in what's today called neuroscience. And I realized, hey, if I accept one of these fellowships, and I had already accepted one from Columbia University. If I go off to school, it's going to be like Auschwitz for the mind. I've been fascinated in the mass passions that are the forces of history, these gods inside of us. since I was 12 years old. And
So you're saying if you
how
had
many
gone
mass-
into upper education, you would have just felt trapped, like jailed, imprisoned?
Yeah, jail, because you
Yeah.
give 22 college students paper and pencil tests in exchange for a college psychology credit. And how many mass passions are you going to see come alive in front of your very eyes in that classroom?
It
Zero.
usually involves like sex for exams. Like that's where the passion gets
Yes,
involved.
That's about as close as you get.
Yeah.
So, and plus my wife, I had gotten married after my freshman year at NYU.
Wow.
And
so you were like,
and my,
how old were you when you went to school?
well, the second time round, because remember, the first time I dropped out of school and hitchhiked and rode the rails and helped found the hippie movement. So by the time I went back to school, I was 21 years old.
Okay. But
And-
still kind of
and I
young.
got-
I mean, you would have been 21, 22 when you got married.
Yeah, so I was
Okay.
22 when I got married. And my wife, who I'd been married to for 3 years at that point, said, I'm tired of having student husbands. Her first husband had been a student at Dartmouth.
Oh, wait.
So,
That begs another question. So you were married for 3 years at the age of 22. So at 19 you were married. But she had a husband before that? How much older was
first
she?
husband. She was 5 years older than I was.
Okay. And she had already
And-
like dropped that guy.
And
Okay.
she dropped that guy. She had a baby by him. She had a 5-year-old.
Okay.
And I'm 5'5". In those days, I was 5'8". So I'm the size of your average household flea. And
The giant dog.
yeah, so you may
5'8"?
be able to find wives or women willing to sleep with you easily. I could not. So when I got this sort of hidden threat from my wife that if I went off to grad school, she wouldn't be around, add that to the Auschwitz for the mind, and I took an opportunity to go into something I knew absolutely nothing about, popular culture. Because popular culture was the music and the culture of the kids who used to beat me up when I was a kid. So I wanted nothing to do with it. But now I had a chance to dive into it. And eventually I founded the biggest PR firm in the music industry and helped establish the careers or sustain the careers of Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon. Brandon, I'm holding you up here.
I was just going to say, how in the world did you get involved in that? If it was like, if you weren't into music and you weren't into popular culture, what took you there? How did you go from A to B?
Well, I took my poetry very seriously, in addition to my science. And one year, the poet in residence said, Bloom, wait until everybody leaves the room. Then lock the door and sit there. And he pointed to the bowling out seat. I have something I need to discuss with you. This did not sound good, Brandon.
No.
So
this
I
sounds
waited till
bad.
everybody left. I closed the door. I sat down in the bowling out seat and he said, look, you, last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You are the editor. You don't even have a faculty advisor. The minute you walk out that door, you're it. Now walk out that door.
Now, were you
Wow.
like still a freshman at
Yeah.
this stage? Junior, senior?
I was a junior.
Okay.
So I walked out the door and looked terribly confused because literary magazines are the most boring looking things in the world. They have these eggshell pale blue colors and these horrible typefaces. And if you found a rip-roaring orgy going anywhere in North America and you threw a literary magazine into the room, you would clear the room in 5 minutes.
It would be like a hand grenade.
Just dead
Yeah,
boners
right,
everywhere.
the hand grenade of infinite boredom. Something straight off of Batman's belt. So I really didn't want to edit a literary magazine. And a kid saw me and said, well, why don't you come down for coffee with me?
Just
Look,
like a
no kid
5-year-old
wanted
just
to have any-
invites you for coffee.
Yeah, he invited me for coffee, and I didn't know what having a cup of coffee was because I hadn't grown up among human beings. I had lab rats and guinea pigs in my bedroom and guppies. That's all. Those are the only creatures that would associate with me.
It's like,
And
hello,
they
friend.
could associate me only because they were in cages, or they would have fled. So he took me down for a cup of coffee. I ordered a glass of water. He ordered a cup of coffee, and he said, now, if you could do anything you wanted with this magazine, what would it be? And I said, it would be a picture book. So I turned it into an experimental graphics and literary magazine and went out hunting for two staffs. One was a staff for poetry and the other one was a staff for art. And by the time this was over, I mean, we had caused a major stir in the commercial art community in New York. I was, when you're a student, you don't realize there's a town around you.
And this
All
is at
you know
NYU,
is,
right?
yeah, even at
Okay.
NYU, all you know is the school.
Right.
And I started getting calls from the art director at Look magazine, the art director at Evergreen Review, which was the leading bohemian magazine in the world at that time, and the art director at Boy's Life.
Now, how
They
is
wanted-
it? I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you.
Yeah.
It's just I always get questions from you. So,
Yeah,
how is it that the art director of Look magazine knew anything about the school literary magazine?
well, that's a very good question, but the first issue made a huge splash, and I was hauled in. I was told I had to go to a meeting at the Student Activities Committee. Matt, I didn't even know there was a Student Activities Committee. So I showed up.
Like,
at
do
student
students have activities?
Yes, and they so I show up at this meeting, and they ooh and they ah about this magazine, which we just produced the first issue of, and then they say we're doubling your budget. Now, how often in your career has that happened?
Yeah,
That
right.
somebody has doubled your budget for anything?
Especially in a school.
Yeah, and the second issue, okay, now I have a
So you went
double
from
budget.
$5 to $10. So that's good.
Well, no, it was a nice hefty budget, because
Yeah.
the first issue we'd done this incredible paper, and I had gone to a printing jobber who taught me all about printing, and I had sat and watched every single issue of that magazine being printed, making sure that there was proper inking on the rollers, that there was no underserved copy of the magazine, that every one was A++. And when the second one came out, I got it into some bookstores on 8th Street, which is the center of the village. It's the spine of both the East Village and the West Village. I don't know how these guys got the magazine. It might have been through those bookstores. I really couldn't tell, but it caused a major stir. It's just, I didn't hear a word about it on campus, not even my non-faculty advisor, the guy who'd kidnapped me into this. So one day he couldn't help but run into me, because he was coming down one street and I was coming down another street, and we couldn't see each other until we'd practically bumped into each other head on. And I said, "What did you think of the magazine?" And he said, "Did you have to put in that awful poem by your friend Jason Snyder about masturbation?" And he walked off. And that was the whole thing. It was the sex and death issue. Well, half the literary staff quit when they saw the direction the magazine was taking, the sex and death issue. But hey,
you were
if
a
don't-
horny little man at the time, apparently.
yes, and if you don't confront those two issues, you're missing out on most of what life is all about.
Yeah, it's all the motivations is like avoiding death and getting sex, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I had an opportunity. It wasn't exactly an opportunity. It was the end of the school year. It was the beginning of the summer. I didn't know what the hell to do with myself. I tried a mild approach to committing suicide. That didn't work out terribly well, because I had nothing else to do with my life. School had been my focus for 4 years, and that was all over. One day after they let me out of the mental institution, which they did for good behavior after 2 weeks, it was an extremely enlightening experience being in the
bet.
mental institution.
Wow.
So when they let me out, I went over to the apartment of the best, the most extraordinary of the artists that I had found. And there was something terribly wrong. He was on the floor, his wife was on the floor, his 3-year-old son was on the floor. It was a wall-to-wall rug. There was no furniture in the room. There was just the bare naked wire of a telephone line, and they were all crying, all three of them. And I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, our furniture was repossessed. They're cutting off our telephone. They're cutting off our electricity, and we're about to be evicted from our apartment." And I said, "What? You're a bloody fucking genius. If anybody sees your work, they'll give you enough money to pay your rent. So look, get your work together, put it in a portfolio. I've got 2 weeks before I have to figure out what summer job I'm going to take. I'll take it out. I'll get you enough work to pay your rent, and then I can go back to my own life."
So would you say that was like your first publicist job, like where you actually picked an artist to publicize? Would that be like your
Sort
first
of.
one?
It wasn't
Okay.
publicity. It was trying to get him work, but
Yeah.
that's called an
Right.
artist rep. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was along those lines.
Okay.
And he said, "But wait, if you take my work out, my best friend and I came here from Boston in order to start an art studio. You have to take his work too." His best friend's work Matt made me nauseous. But I said, okay, this is a desperate situation. I got to make sure his rent is paid. So, and then his best friend's wife put in her work, and her work was actually very good. And I started taking this stuff out, just using the yellow pages to find people who could use their services. And after 2 weeks, I hadn't sold anything. And by the end of the summer, I still hadn't sold anything. I'd gotten New York Magazine interested in doing a feature on the studio, but I hadn't sold anything. So realizing, okay, I got these two choices. Do I stick with this, which is a periscope position, into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made, the stuff that really interested me from the age of 12 on, or do I go to grad school? And I picked sticking with what I was doing, art school.
So when did you sell some art by him? How long did it take?
It probably took about a year, maybe 8 months.
So they basically got evicted because you took so long selling their stuff.
No, somehow we got them enough money to survive.
Oh, that's good.
I don't know how. And because the first year, we only earned $75 a week apiece. Now, of course, in those days, the late 1960s, $75 was a huge amount of money today. But still, it was piffling. It was barely enough to pay for groceries. And so here I am in this world I know nothing about, but I do know that it is the world of modern myth making. Eventually, after 3 years, we became the leading avant-garde art studio on the East Coast, commercial art studio. And there was a guy named Matty Simmons. And Matty Simmons had co-invented this thing for American Express called the credit card. And he'd made a lot of money. And now he wanted to be a publisher. So Matty Simmons was treating me as if he were my father. It was absolutely wonderful. And then Matty had an idea. There was this magazine that came out of Harvard that used to go on sale on newsstands all over America and would sell out within 2 hours. And they only put it out once or twice a year. So Matty flew up to Boston and went to the kids who were turning out that year's issue and said, look, what I'd like you to do is come to New York City and put out your magazine every month. And I will put you in apartments so glorious that all of your friends will drop their jaws from envy. And I will give you a salary so large that every woman in the Western Hemisphere will want to sleep with you. And all you have to do is turn out the magazine for me once a month. Now, the magazine at Harvard had been called the Lampoon. So the new magazine that Matty put together was called the National Lampoon. And he gave us, my studio, the job of art directing the National Lampoon. Well, remember the artist whose work was so horrible that it would make you cough up everything you'd eaten for the previous 3 days?
The friend of the guy? Yeah.
Yeah. So
friend of the guy who did the thing?
Yeah. So as soon as he saw this magazine landing on our plate, he convinced the rest of the artists in the studio to lock me out, to vote me out of the studio. Well, half of them went for it and the other half didn't and came with me. But the real reason he wanted me out wasn't to save on the percentage on my commission, which is what he told the other members of the group. It was to take over the National Lampoon's art direction himself. And it was the worst move those artists could have made because they threw me out. They did the next 7 issues, actually, the first 7 issues of the National Lampoon. It was nauseating. It was horrible. It was monstrous. And the result was that they lost the account. And when they lost the account, remember the artist on the floor with his wife and his 3-year-old? Right. That artist went back to drinking heavily and he died in his 40s of alcohol poisoning. And the others stopped doing well as well. So it was a mistake for them to do that. But I
have those issues of the National Lampoon because I have almost
do.
A complete
well,
run.
Take a look.
They really were. The first year, they didn't know what they were doing. And then they got a new
not
guy.
At all.
Yeah,
and that was because of this one guy pirating the whole thing.
They were very ugly.
But I needed this because I was doing this for 3 years and I might never have stopped because once I get involved in a project, I just drown in it. I mean, I drown in a highly productive way, but I forget the rest of the world.
So you're immersed
And-
in it, to use.
So
Yeah.
how,
You're not
how do you
actually
get
dying. You're like subsuming it all.
right? So
Right.
how do you get from National Lampoon now to Michael Jackson or Prince, or who was your first big musical client?
Well, the deal is that they throw me out. Meanwhile, when I was 12, a girl in my 8th grade class had turned her eyes in my direction, which had never happened before. And then she made eye contact, which had also never happened before. And once she had my eyes locked on hers, she said, "I told my mother you understand the theory of relativity." And I was reading 2 books a day under the desk, and I understood a lot of science, and I had compiled a lot of scientific credentials, if you can believe that. But I didn't understand the theory of relativity, and I didn't dare confess that to her. So I jumped on my bicycle. I pedaled to the local library as fast as I could. The librarians literally knew me better than my mother did. I said, "Give me everything you've got on relativity." They slid 2 books across the desk, a great big fat book and a little skinny book. And I put them in my bicycle clamp and drove home as fast as I could and started reading the big fat book. I got 50 pages into it. It was 8 o'clock at night. I realized, oh my God, I've got 2 hours and my mom's going to put me to sleep, and I still don't understand the theory of relativity. So I turned to the little skinny book written by Einstein all by himself. And in it, Einstein had an introduction. And in his introduction, it felt like he grabbed me by the front of the shirt and put his nose up to mine and said, "Schmuck, listen up. To be a genius, it's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then express it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it." In other words, Albert Einstein, one of my heroes, had told me unequivocally, to be an original scientific thinker, you're going to have to be a writer, and not just any writer. You're going to have to be an exquisite, mouth-watering, extraordinary writer. So while I was doing Cloud Studio, I got involved with 2 magazines. I became a contributing editor to 2 magazines because that's the kind of writing I felt Einstein really wanted me to do. You know, really accessible stuff that people can enjoy the hell out of.
So we're in your 20s right now, right?
I'm in my 20s,
Okay,
right? My
good.
early
Because
20s.
we were 12 for a moment there. I want to get back to
Yes.
okay, we're in the 12s.
Back to
Yeah.
my 20s. So you got it. So they throw me out of the studio, and one day I am covering a parapsychology convention for one of the 2 magazines, Natural Lifestyles. And you know, parapsychology conventions, spoon benders, mind readers, etc. And because I'm covering this thing, I have no memory, none. So I'm writing notes like crazy. And some kid, just a year or 2 younger than I am, walks up to me and says, "How would you like to edit a magazine?" What? The only thing he knows about me is he sees me taking notes. And he assumes from that I'm a journalist, which I am, but still. So in those days,
And this is at a parapsychology conference.
Yeah, this is a parapsychology conference.
Okay.
So maybe he was reading my mind. You never know.
That's right.
So in those days, when somebody sets you up for a meeting with somebody, there is no Google. You have no way to look them up. You have no clue as to who you're going to a meeting with. So
Right.
I went to this meeting at one UN plaza, which overlooks the East River and overlooks the UN because it's on UN property. And it's like 18 stories up or something like that, has this astonishing view up the river and down the river. And the publisher says the magazine's called Circus. And okay, I've never been fond of circuses, but I figure if you love your audience and you have sufficient research material available, you can write about anything.
So this is late 60s?
This is 1971.
71. Okay.
71.
Right. And now I'm 28 years old. And he says, no, it's not about clowns and elephants. It's about rock and roll. So that's my basic introduction to rock and roll.
Okay, cool.
So at that point, I become a Talmudic scholar of rock and roll music. You know, I make my own tuna fish sandwiches. I put them in a brown paper bag. I sit there with a brown paper bag at lunchtime with Melody Maker and New Musical Express, these British rock magazines spread out around me. I'm studying like crazy. I want to know
You're having
the names.
arguments with other hard rock rabbis.
Oh, no, because nobody will talk to me. I mean, it's pretty much the story of my life. Nobody will talk to me.
We'll talk to you, Howard.
What about the
Well,
disco rabbits?
So that was the introduction to rock and roll. And then when at Circus, the publisher came to me one day, and we're a year and a half into the magazine. The publisher has set me, he's told me what he really wants. He wants a magazine that'll read like Time magazine. Well, I grew up reading Time magazine from cover to cover. My best friend and I always tied for first place in the Time magazine current events contest at our high school, which means they were only given one, our school was only given one prize, and they didn't want to have to rip it in half, so neither of us got a prize. But
you both lose.
yeah, so I knew
That's how it
Time
was back
magazine.
then.
Thanks,
That's like the law-
teachers. Thanks for
laws of
boosting
Solomon.
my self-esteem, teacher.
Right. So I knew Time magazine backwards and forwards, but this was an opportunity to really study all the subtle moves that I'd missed. And there were two magazines in Europe that sold 1 million copies each in markets a fifth the size of the United States. So I studied the tricks and traps of those magazines, trying to figure out how they achieved what they achieved. And then at the end of 10 months, I came back to my publisher and I said, look, if you give me sales figures for the magazine and you let me do simple correlational studies, I guarantee you we will sell magazines. And he was reluctant because he'd never given the sales figures before to his editors, but he gave them to me. And I came back to him in 2 months and said, okay, here's the formula. It breaks every single rule you've ever used, but this is the formula. And we increased in circulation 211% in the next 12 months. So 6 months into this meteoric rise in circulation, he came to me and said, don't you think it's about time we talk about a raise? Well, remember, I'd never worked for anybody else. So, and I get lost in any project I'm doing and lose sight of the outside world. So I said, okay. And I called my friends from Rags, the underground fashion magazine I had been a contributing editor to, and they'd all gone on to Vogue, and one had co-founded Ms. with Gloria Steinem, and they all had illustrious careers. And I said, how much should I be asking for a raise? And they said, well, tell me what you do. And I explained. And now one thing you have to know, when I first walked into the publisher's office, I passed a broom closet on my right, and there were two guys packing in that broom closet to go. In other words, I had replaced 2 editors. So when I gave them all the list of what I was doing, they said, okay, you should ask for a 60% raise. So I went back to Jerry Rothberg, my publisher, who I loved the hell out of. I just enjoyed working with him tremendously, and said, this is the raise. And he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't afford that. And I said, well, now look, you know, I don't know normal. All I could think of was that to save my dignity, I would have to resign. So I gave him 6 months notice, and I found a substitute. I found another editor who I trained, and I wrote a 57-page booklet on how to turn out Circus magazine, the whole damn formula. But when I left, I couldn't find a job, possibly because my wife and I went down to Barney's to search for normal clothes for me. And what we found were these great big pleated clown pants that were plaid.
Well, you're working at Circus, so that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense. But when I walked into interviews, I don't think it made a terribly good impression. So the guy I hired to be my replacement said, there's somebody who wants to meet you. His name is Seymour Stein. Seymour Stein is the founder of Sire Records. He's the guy who would go on to discover Madonna. And Seymour had me hired to head a public and artist relations department for Gulf and Western's 14 record companies. Gulf and Western was the biggest conglomerate in the world. It was called Engulf and Devour by magazines like Time magazine back in those days. So I started the public and artist relations department, and I was credited with doubling the value of Gulf and Western's music holdings. And ABC bought Gulf and Western's record companies, and they flew a vice president into New York who gathered every single member of the staff, over 50 of us. We had never seen each other in a single room before. And he said, go on about your business as usual. There will be no blood flowing in the corridors of this company. Well, from the instant he said that, I knew there would be blood flowing and it would be
Right,
copious.
it's like, thank you for the premonition.
Right.
Yeah, so I went back to my staff and I said, drop everything that you're doing. I want you to find every minute we've ever gotten on radio, every minute we've ever gotten on TV, every inch we've ever gotten in magazines and newspapers. I want you to go to standard rate and data service and figure out exactly what all those minutes would have cost if they'd been paid for with an advertising budget. And so that's
Smart.
what we did. That's what we did for the next 5 days. And I discovered that for every $1 that Gulf and Western had invested in my department, they had gotten $11 worth of coverage back. And then it was the middle of winter. And in the middle of winter in New York City, you pile up in taxis. You pair up in taxis.
So this is now around what, 1977?
It would have been about 1975.
75.
And or 1974, something like that. And okay, so there's this humongous snowstorm, and I have a cab pick me up, and the cab driver says, "Would you mind if I pick somebody else up?" And he drives down to Young and Rubicam, one of the major ad agencies at the time, and I tell the story of how by spending $1 you get $11 back to this advertising executive, and he says, "Oh no, you've got that wrong." Well, I knew it had to be too good to be true, right? I mean, $11 for every one you invest, that's just impossible. And he says, no, that's not what I mean. In advertising, we count every inch of editorial as worth 5 times as much as an inch of advertising.
Oh, right.
So for every
it's
$1 they spent
$55.
on you, they've gotten $55.
Yeah.
Right.
So then Gulf and Western sells, well, they have sold the whole kit and caboodle. And all those people in that room within the next 1 or 2 weeks, every single one of them on the same Thursday gets pink slips, with the exception of one. And that one is me. And I mean, it's circus.
And did you yell out, "Suck it, bitches," on the way while they were all?
Almost, because when I left circus, they had to hire 5 people to replace me. It would have been far cheaper for Jerry to give me that 60% raise. So I never wanted to have to work like 5 people again in my life.
Right.
It's bad enough when I work like one Bloom, because the burden I put on myself is
Yeah, we've
extraordinary.
all seen the documentary. We know what you do.
So at any rate, I turned in my resignation, and the same vice president who had flown in to give the no blood in the corridor speech was at my desk the next morning. And he said, "Take out a blank piece of paper." I took it out. He said, "Put your name at the top." I put my name at the top. He said, "Fill in the names of all of the staff members you want to keep." And I filled in their names. He said, "Now fill in the salaries you want." He's giving me a blank check. So I gave us all 20% raises, and we were in business for ABC. And then the attorney who negotiated the deal between Gulf and Western and ABC called. Now, I have nothing to do with attorneys. I don't know what they do, and it's just not something that interests me. And he says, "You know why we were able to sell that pissant little record company to ABC for so much money, don't you?" Well, I didn't have a clue. It's not my business. And he said, "It's because of you." And I thought, this guy has got to be joking. And then I found out that Seymour Stein had flown to LA to meet with the president of ABC and said, "You can't get rid of these guys or we're leaving." The head of Dot Records in Nashville, which was the number 3 record company in country and Western, had flown to LA and said exactly the same thing. He was right. He was apparently right. And one day, Seymour Stein was coming down the corridor at ABC, where I now had an office, and he stuck his head in my office and he said, "Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?" Now, remember, I can't do anything other people can do. I can't play baseball. I can't play football. I can't even watch football, for God's sakes.
Yeah. So there, Brendan.
Yeah. So, and so it was the challenge of,
You just made 2 really good friends over on, whatever side of the Hollywood squares they're on, because they're non-sports people. I like watching football, but there you go.
well, so this was like the challenge from the girl in 8th grade. You can challenge me on anything and I'll take it, but don't challenge me on my brain, because it's the only thing I've got. As minuscule as it is, it's the only thing I've got. So I ended up founding my own company. But first, while I was still working for Gulf and Western or for ABC, when I got to ABC, there was this miracle occurring. In the days of Gulf and Western, we never had a piece of music on the charts. Country charts, yes, but not the pop charts, ever. And when I landed at ABC, they had a record at number 3 on the pop charts. I had never had that privilege in my life. So I got on that record immediately, and I immediately discovered that nobody else in the company was going to join me on it, because in those days it was unhip. This is not going to sound credible. In those days, it was unhip for white people to work on black artists. Can you believe that?
Yeah,
so
I mean, back in the day, I can totally believe it.
Yeah,
Different
so
time,
not
sure.
a soul in the company would touch it. And I found out that the manager was about to fly from LA back to New York, where he lived with his wife, Diana Ross, and his baby daughter, Tracee Ellis Ross. And I
Who's
picked
now
him up
famous in her own right. Yeah.
Yep. And I picked him up at the airport, knowing that we would be baked into Manhattan traffic for the next hour and a half, and he would be a prisoner in the limousine. And
Captive audience.
And I said, look, I know your band prides themselves on their democracy, but if you let me pull the lead singer up front and put all the attention on her, and you cover my ass with the band, I guarantee you I will deliver a star. And this is the first time I ever said it, and I've only said it twice. And he did. He covered my ass beautifully. And I was able to focus on the lead singer, and her name was Chaka Khan. So that was the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was the beginning of discovering that there is something in here, in your gut, that will deliver certain messages to you if you immerse yourself in your work every waking hour of the day, 7 days a week.
I did want to give you a little bit of credit for somebody else you had discovered earlier on in your career from this story, because this is based upon an interview I'd heard of yours, where you had brought the knowledge of Stephanie Mills to people. And
that was another one. Well, that was an accident too. I mean, it was.
Well, this is the credit I want to give you. So Greg and I actually
I'm so glad you know about her, because I was at Gulf and Western.
Yeah. We
had of our 14 labels, only 2 were functional, and that was Dot Records and Sire Records. And Paramount was totally dysfunctional. The A&R guy was this absolute delight. He'd come in to your office just blithering enthusiasm. And he would tell you about the gorilla, the smash, the absolute superstar that he had just discovered. And you knew that when he turned around and walked out, that was the last time you'd ever hear of that artist in your life. We're going nowhere. So one day he walked into my office and gave me the speech about the Godzilla, the smash, etc., that he just discovered. And then he said, and I've got her doing a showcase at the Plaza Hotel tomorrow at noon. Okay, now this I could not get out of. I was the head of public and artist relations. That meant it was my job to show the artists that we cared about them. Now, I was totally honest if you were not on our priority list. Totally honest. But at least I owed you the courtesy of being there. So I went over to the Plaza Hotel the next day, and it's one of those rooms that has semicircular tiers that mount up of seating. It's a little nightclub. Mm-hmm. And onto the stage walks this little 4'8" 13-year-old squashed toad-like African woman.
Toad-like.
And
squashed?
And yes, and when she takes the microphone in her hand and looks around the room, it feels as if she has reached right into your throat and grabbed you by the trachea and dragged your nose up to hers.
Just like Einstein did to you earlier.
Yeah, and said, sit, stand, shake hands, obey. And from that moment on, for the next 45 minutes, you belong to her, utterly and completely. And the ferocity with which her eyes seem to be looking at yours from a distance of 6 inches is absolutely riveting. Your whole body is riveted by it. I had never seen anything like it, ever in my life.
Now, that's what I thought the first time I saw Michael Bolton.
Well, yeah, and he used to be an acquaintance. But at any rate, I'm surprised. I mean, because he's such a good good-looking guy, you don't expect talent. But
that means that we're all incredibly talented people.
yes. So there was a power play going on. The head of our company, Tony Martell of the Gulf and Western companies, before I ever reached the company, his son had been diagnosed with leukemia, and that was a terminal illness back then. It meant certain death. So he stopped doing everything he was doing, came into the office at 9 o'clock in the morning, which is an unholy hour for a record company president, and disappeared into his office with the doors locked all day long, and then left at 5 o'clock. We had no idea of what he was doing. And because he wasn't running the company, a really powerful little 5'4" man went to the heads of Gulf and Western and said, look, your little pissant record company is not making you a penny. In fact, it's losing you money. Put it under my control. You see how much money I'm making for you at Paramount Pictures, the company I run. Just watch to see how much money I make for you with this record company. And so the control of our company had been handed over to Frank Yablans, who was the president of Paramount Pictures during one of the hottest streaks Paramount has ever had. And so one day when we walked into the office, there was something strange. There was this room over to our right that we always passed. It was always dark, and we all knew what it was. It was the Xerox room. How did we know that? Our secretaries would go in there to get more Xerox paper. But today, the room was brightly lit. That had never happened before. And all the Xerox boxes were cleared out. And it turned out it was a conference room. There was this conference table in the middle of the room, and it had yellow pads at every seat and sharpened pencils at every seat. And we were told we were going to have a staff meeting. So we all threaded
This is like a
into
heads are
this-
gonna roll meeting?
We don't know. We have no
okay.
clue.
Blood will flow.
So we all walk into this meeting, and there's an 8.5 by 11 sheet printed out in front of each chair. And apparently it's a list of records that we're supposed to be putting out. But none of us have ever heard of any of these records before. So Tony Martell takes
It's
the
like
head of
the
the
greatest
table.
hits of the polka legends or something, or
Yeah, God knows. And he's about 6'1", and he takes the head of the table for the very first time in my entire time at this company. And he starts talking about how we have to save money on yellow pads and pencils because we're losing money. And then all of a sudden, it feels like at the door behind us, it feels like trumpets are blaring. It feels like 10,000 laser beams have just gone off. It feels like someone is being delivered on a cloud with chariots behind him
that's some
into the
imagery.
room. And you don't even see it. You just feel it. And
Right.
I want to feel that one day.
this little 5'4" man comes walking down the length of the table toward Tony Martell. And the closer he gets to Tony Martell, the more Tony slinks and slinks and slinks and slopes in his seat until he finally slides off like a jellyfish. And Frank
That is
Frank
bizarre.
Yablans takes over the head of the table. And Frank Yablans looks at this agenda with all of these records listed, and he looks at record number 1, and he looks at the first department head on his left, and he says, "You, what are you doing about this record?" And now I have heard of bullshitting on oral exams, but I have never seen it in my life. All of a sudden, I see it before my very eyes. This guy
this is what I'm doing.
He probably hasn't even heard of this record before. And he makes up this long, elaborate, detailed story of all the brilliant, heroic things he is doing on behalf of this record. Then Martell or Yablans gets to number 2, and he gets another astonishing story. And I'm number 4. And Yablans says, "What are you doing about this record?" And I stand up and I say, "Mr. Yablans, I'm not doing anything about this record. In fact, I'm not doing anything about any of the records on this list. But yesterday, I saw a girl named Stephanie Mills, and I proceeded to describe what I just described to you. And when I was finished, and she is getting 40% of my time." And Yablans got up out of the chair, walked down the length of the table again, and walked out of the room in utter silence. So you never notice that when you're in a room with a dozen people, you're all trying to get out of the doorway at once, and you're crammed in like sardines.
Right.
So while we're cramming through the door, The vice president, who Seymour Stein had convinced to hire me, grabbed me by the right bicep so hard that I had the marks of his fingers on my bicep for the rest of the week. And he said, "You fucking none. If you ever do that again, you're fired." And when I got to my office, I couldn't quite get there because my secretary was standing 30 feet away from my office door waiting for me. And she said, "You had a call from Mr. Yablon's office. He wants to see you and Stephanie Mills tomorrow at noon. He's calling a meeting of all of his department heads." So that was the beginning of Stephanie Mills'
Wow.
career.
Well, this is where I wanted to give you the credit. So Greg and I were at a karaoke night a couple nights ago, and there were these kids who were like 22, 23 years old singing a Stephanie Mills song.
Amazing.
And I'm like, and I hadn't heard her name for years until I
Right.
was watching this documentary with you. Actually, it was an interview with you. And I'm like, well, this is just weirdly ironic that this is happening just before we're going to have this interview with you. And so I really wanted to give you that story and give you some good feelings about, the fact that the work that you did back then promoting her has gone forward even until 2021.
These youngsters singing the songs at karaoke, though.
22-year-olds singing the Stephanie Mills song. I'm like,
that's
this is bizarre.
astonishing.
Yeah.
That
So
is
anyway,
astonishing.
so I appreciate the background story on
But
that.
that's how I did PR.
Yeah.
In other words, it was a kamikaze approach. If I was your publicist and I believed in you, you had me, even if I was risking death. Literally, you had me, even if I was risking death.
And so this is how you get into dealing with Michael Jackson, is you left Gulf Western and
Well,
started your own
remember
publicity
when
for him. Right.
Seymour Stein says, "Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?"
And did you actually think about changing your name to Schmuck? Because you said that a couple of times. People have called you that.
Does come up in my life a lot, doesn't it?
Hey, Schmuck. Oh, it's not Howard anymore. Just call me Schmuck.
Right. So I called a number of people about it, and one of the people was Danny. What's Danny's last name? It'll come to me. Danny
Elfield?
Goldberg. Danny Goldberg. Remember the two guys packing up their things in a converted
In the
broom closet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Danny was one of those two guys.
Those are the guys from
So-
Circus Magazine, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And then when I arrived at Gulf and Western, there was just a big empty 3-room with 3 windows overlooking the park from the 23rd floor, which was awesome. And 1 file cabinet. Well, the previous head of public and artist relations, who had long since abandoned the place, thus I was able to found a department totally based on my own ways to do things. But the previous guy was, guess who? Danny Goldberg. And Danny Goldberg would go on to become the president of Atlantic Records and the president of Polygram Records, and would help discover grunge rock in Seattle, and would be the manager for, I think it was Nirvana, and a whole mess of other things. So I got Danny on the phone. He wasn't a close friend, but in a sense, I really don't have close friends.
That's why we do this podcast, because we don't either.
So I called Danny, and Danny said, "Look, I'm starting a PR and management business, and I have an assistant, and I have room on my dining room coffee table. And if you can clear half of that room, you can have it. And if you can pay half my assistant's salary, you can have half of her time. And why don't you start your business here?" So I started my business on 74th Street in Danny Goldberg's living room, but it was called the Howard Bloom Organization from the beginning, because I never wanted to be doing the work of 10 people again in my life. If it called for 10 or 15 people, I wanted to have 10 or 15 people. And I discovered along the line, I was going to have to train these people from scratch, because if they'd been trained in somebody else's version of publicity, it wasn't going to be what I felt I owed my clients. It'd be nowhere near it. So that's when the Howard Bloom Organization became the training ground for the best publicists in the business.
Now, both
Go
Matt
ahead,
and
Brian.
I did. I was going to say, both Matt and I dabbled in public relations and publicity in our early days. I would be fascinated to hear when you say, I taught them like what I felt the essentials for public relations and publicity were. What are they? If you can.
Well, the first essential
Let's
is
get some
having a
paper and
good
pen out and make a textbook out of it.
Yeah, it's having a genuinely good story. It's having a genuinely good story that can make a difference in other people's lives somehow. And I don't mean by, hang on, let me take a swig of water before these frogs in the throat overwhelm me.
Yeah, you're totally allowed to do that at any point during this. We have no real rules, other than just talk
Okay.
to us.
So step
Be our
one,
friend.
the story has to be dramatic. You have to be able to put the story in 3 or 4 sentences because you need to be able to get it across on the phone. If anyone will still take phone calls. And I'm not sure because people who didn't take phone calls would take phone calls from me, but that's because I built my relationships year after year after year. And because, well, I'll give you an example. I had this client in the early days of the Howard Bloom organization called Betty Davis. She was Miles Davis's first wife, and she was a wonderful woman. I mean, I had such fun working with her that it was ridiculous. And she had one of the most extraordinary wardrobes you've ever seen in your life, and this tiny little hourglass figure that fit into the wardrobe perfectly. And Betty Davis would go to celebrity parties twice a week. And I trained Betty to let me know when she'd come from one of these celebrity parties, and I would debrief her on every piece of gossip that she turned up. So I didn't have the Rolling Stones as clients. I didn't have the Beatles as clients. I didn't have the heavy hitters as clients. However, through Betty's stories, I had Mick Jagger, I had Paul McCartney, I had anybody that she'd been able to pick up a rumor about. So I would call Rolling Stone and, the bits and pieces section, the tiny little news items, which I had been taught by the art director at Boy's Life, was the most read section of any magazine, the first thing that most people turn to. So I would call the editor of that section, and I'd have superstar stories for him coming out the kazoo, even though these weren't my clients.
This is all
So
like little blurbs, you mean? Or
yeah, little
Okay.
blurbs. So step one is have a good and valid story. Step two is cultivate your sources. I don't really mean your sources, I mean your outlets. Cultivate the people who matter. Know something about the press. The press is in 1837, Thomas Carlyle, the social commentator,
Right.
talked about how in those days there was a rock crit elite, the equivalent of the rock journalists elite. But in those days, it was theater critics because theater was the pop culture form.
Yeah.
And Carlyle was trying to explain how this little social group works. And he talked about a friend in Germany who was out in a field one Sunday and saw 2,000 sheep coming. Now, sheep, when they're walking in the countryside, they walk between poplar trees on these narrow little lanes. And if you've ever tried taking a girlfriend for a date on one of these country lanes, it's murder because the lane is so narrow, you have to walk in single file and you've got your hand behind you leading her along and you can't see her or listen to her or anything. That's because those are sheep lanes and the sheep go single file down those narrow lanes. So Carlyle's friend had taken his walking stick and put it out in front of the lead sheep. And the lead sheep had jumped over the walking stick. And then he'd withdrawn his walking stick. Well, guess what the other 1,999 sheep had done at precisely the point where the walking stick had been, but was now gone.
They had an orgy.
Every single one of them had jumped.
Right.
And the press operated, at least in my day, on the same principles. If one of the lead sheep, if the Village Voice, Rolling Stone, or the New York Times loved something, critics all over the country loved it. If those 3 publications hated something, then critics all over the country would hate it. So you had to develop relationships at the bellwether publications, at the
Right.
publications everybody else followed. And to do that, you had to give people valid material that would help them achieve their goals. And meantime, the most essential ally you have in publicity is truth. On the rare occasions when somebody tried to hand me a story that I found was weak, I would go back to them and make them change the nature of the product itself to make sure that what it was they were trying, that what they were trying to sell was actually valid, because there was no way I could sell a bullshit. There's no way I, at least, could sell a bullshit project.
Right.
So
No
if
way
you
in
were
hell.
representing Greg's punk band back in the 90s, I mean,
Right.
if you were still in the field, what would you do? Would you get Greg out of his hoodie, or would you go, we're going to go with the hoodie to...
No, the deal is, if you walked into my office representing Greg,
and his band
and
was
you-
called the Weird Lovemakers, by the way. I'm going to get that
Oh,
band
God.
famous one of these days, Greg. But anyway,
so if you
Good
walked
luck.
into my office and you wanted me to work with the Weird Love Makers, I gave you a little lecture. And I explained that if you came into my office expecting me to fashion an artificial mask for Greg and to call it an image and to tell you that with this image, I'm going to make you a star, then I'll send you to my best competitor and you'll literally be in his office in less than 2 hours. I don't do that. If I'm going to work with Greg, then my job is to find the gods inside of him. My job is to find the soul inside of him. What do I mean?
because
Greg,
we know
it's a-
that Greg has no soul.
Aha. Well,
I'm
it's
an
a Tuesday.
atheist too.
Well, it's a Tuesday afternoon. Greg has got an album to do. He sits down in front of a blank computer screen or a blank piece of paper. He knows that he can never write a lyric in his life. He has no idea of how he's ever written a lyric in the past. On a reasonably good day, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a lyric in front of him. And once or twice in his life, the lyric is so perfect that it felt like it wrote itself through him. My job is to find the gods inside of him that wrote those lyrics. On a good night, when Greg goes in front of an audience, he sees the pupils of the audience widening. He sees their faces melting. He feels their energy congealing into one big amoebic blob. He feels that blob reach a pseudopod out to him.
And then he
send
quit
its energy
taking acid at that point.
I usually saw them walking out the door. I never saw them
Oh, my
like this
God.
when we
Oh, yeah.
played live.
Well, so at any rate, the point is that you have an out-of-body experience when the audience does that to you. When the first time that happened to me, I thought I was on the ceiling watching the whole thing take place down below me. I had no control over my body whatsoever. It was all in the grip of this energy that was tunneling up through me from the audience and tunneling and transmogrifying itself somewhere around my head and being channeled back to the audience again.
And this is
And-
while you were an audience member, or while you were on
No,
stage?
that was while I was on stage.
Like giving
So-
a speech or something, or
No, it was in high school. I can tell you that story. But
okay.
but the point is, so my job is to find the gods inside of you that dance you like a marionette on a
Got
good night.
Right.
And if
so you
we
found the
don't
drive
find
and the
those,
passion and the motivations, and you like distilled those.
right, and
Okay.
through the story of how you got to be, how music became important to you. Usually, it starts at the age of 5.
Right. Is
Go
that
ahead.
something? Is that something that you did? I mean, that seems like that's a part of what makes the Howard Bloom organization. The Howard Bloom organization. That was something you drew out of it. So, in our hypothetical example, you took Greg and sat down with him, and I don't know, went through a process or a questionnaire, or just
You
Well, no,
didn't
I-
shoot yourself
I-
at the end of the 7 hours with Greg.
I insisted that I get 6 weeks to study everything that Greg has ever written. Everything that's ever been written about him, everything I can get my hands on, every album cover. And then that I be able to come to see Greg in his own surroundings. No wives, no managers, no assistants, no intercessors of any kind, just me and Greg. And usually I discovered in going back over what I did, you usually had to be outside of your own home, because your home is where you are with your wife, and you have your wife personality at your house. So I've got to see you in something that's more akin to your working environment.
Like at a
One way
strip
or the
club.
other. What's that?
Like at a strip club or something.
Yes, that would
A
Your
be
locker
work
room.
environment. Were you stripping also, Greg? I didn't know about that part.
I was in my past. I don't like to talk about it.
yeah. Let's not.
I didn't do very well, as you
Yeah,
can
just
imagine.
don't do it now. We don't really.
Greg's breasts have sagged since then. So,
A little bit. A little.
Oh, they have.
Mine have expanded.
oh God. So that was the deal. I called it secular shamanism because it was like, you know how a dowser has a Y-shaped stick and he's
Mhm.
going across the landscape waiting for the stick to dip? And that's what I was doing with your soul. with the gods inside of you.
So you were dowsing for the thing to write the story about.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
And
Okay.
usually it was hooked around your passion points. It turned out you had imprinting points at the age of 5 and at the age of 10 to 15. And so, for example, the passion point for Prince, I said, what was the first thing that got you into music? And Prince, I had been called by Warner Brothers. Warner had said, you're going to have an impossible time with this client. He can't do interviews. We set him up for 2 interviews out here. He was in total silence and then tried to strangle the interviewer in one interview.
Awesome.
And in the other interview, he was just plain silent. So that's what I was told about Prince. And I went up to see him in my hometown, Buffalo, New York, at the Shea Theater, where he was rehearsing for the Dirty Minds tour. And I watched as a band rehearsed. Then when they finished, then at 1 a.m. or so, we went backstage, found a room where we could lock ourselves in. And I asked him, what's the first thing that got you into music? And he said, well, I was 5 years old. My mom took me to see my dad. His dad was a jazz musician. Took me to see my dad perform or rehearse. And on stage, there was my dad in the spotlight. And he was surrounded by 5 of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in my life. And that was it. That's what turned Prince on to music. And most of us have moments like that in our lives. For example, Kevin Cronin of REO Speedwagon had 2 of those imprinting points. Now, imprinting points are where sex and attention meet. So Kevin Cronin had 1 imprinting point when he was 5 and saw the Beatles performing on the Ed Sullivan Show, and a second imprinting point when he was 15 and it was when he was 5, it was Elvis Presley performing on the Ed Sullivan Show. When he was 15, it was the Beatles performing on the Ed Sullivan Show. So generally, your story contains the story of how you got to be who you are when you fireball on stage involuntarily.
So Prince you got into before Purple Rain and before 1999.
Yes.
And so you did the publicity for those particular albums?
Well, the deal was that when I had first gotten into the business, when I was still at Circus Magazine, there were these 2 guys who took me out to lunch. They were with Decca Records, and Decca really didn't have any clients that were useful to me at Circus. They had Al Green, who they practically worshiped, and they didn't yet have ZZ Top. But these 2 guys were workaholics like me, and they taught me every Monday morning the 3 trade magazines, Billboard, Record World, and Cashbox, come out. You sit in your office for 2 hours and you do nothing but study those magazines. You read them from cover to cover. So one day I was reading through the trade magazines, and there was this artist I never heard of who was rising on the R&B charts. And it was strange that I'd never heard of him. And then a few weeks later, his album went platinum. That never happens. He never appeared on the pop charts, just the R&B charts.
Huh.
And his album was going platinum, and no one had ever heard of him. And then a week later, I got a call saying Earth, Wind & Fire's manager would like you to work with his new client. Would you be interested? Well, the new client was the unknown person I'd been tracking on the charts and who I'd been extremely curious about. That was Prince. So I started with Prince when he was totally unknown.
So these discoveries were the things that really drove you to, to start codifying your theory of the gods inside of people?
It took a long time. I started my company in 1976, and I had this down pat by 1981 or so.
Okay.
That's a long time. That's 5 years.
Yeah, in the entertainment business, because people come and go in that
Right.
time period, like flashes in the pan.
Right.
And so then that kind of comes to the time, I think your illness came around the late 80s, right?
1988.
Okay. And so you turned your organization over, your publicity organization over. Does that organization still exist in some form?
The publicists were absolutely convinced that I was unnecessary and simply skimming money off the top. Although I took a very low salary. A friend of mine from Record World, who was the editor-in-chief of Record World, was aghast when he heard what I paid myself because it was so low. But my emphasis was on paying my staff enough that I could give you a higher quality service than anybody else in the business. but I flew down I made my usual demands. Island Records, Chris Blackwell had sort of kept me as his brain trust for years at that point. Chris Blackwell had been behind Betty Davis, too. And he had this new act that he wanted me to work with called Womack and Womack. And they had a farm down in West Virginia or something like that. And I flew down to Virginia and got into a Jeep and bounced through the countryside for 5 hours and went to this building they were building that looked like a big aircraft hangar. And it wasn't finished, so there was no heat. And it was March 10th, and it was cold. There were sheep grazing outside, and there was no furniture in the place. So we all sat on the floor for 5 hours while he interviewed them, and it was absolutely fascinating. And then, because they came from coal mining country, and in coal mining country, the black coal miners, it had never occurred to me before that there were black coal miners. And
I think they all become black at some point in the coal mines.
That's quite true. So the black coal miners basically kept up their spirits by singing in the mines, and then sang in church on the weekends, and then toured in school buses during the weekends. So that's where the gospel culture, a good part of the black gospel culture, had come from. So at any rate, I flew back to New York. I was busy arranging my notes on a little TRS 100 computer, the very first laptop computer. And then when I got home, I realized I had something very uncharacteristic. I'd left my computer on the plane. Whoever found it walked off with it, apparently. Fortunately, I had another one at home, was able to reconstruct the notes. But then over the weekend, I felt I had a cold. And the best way to get rid of a cold is to work your fucking ass off. And it generally drives the cold away. So that's what I did all weekend. And then Monday, I don't know what happened. And Tuesday, I was so weak that they had to carry me in a fireman's carry down to waiting car service and send me home. And then I was home for the next 3 months. So when I thought I'd gotten better, I hadn't. I kept getting worse. And finally, I called in the staff and I said, I don't know what's happening to me. The doctors don't have a clue. And for all I know, I'm dying. So I'm giving the business to you. And the next day, Michael Jensen, who has his own successful PR firm to this day, called and said, and he offered me a large amount of money for my company. Well, I said, I've already given it to my staff. And the staff, as I said, was convinced that I was unnecessary and they were really the brains of the operation. And they ground the company into the dirt in a year. They couldn't keep it going.
Oh, wow. So your legacy just...
You still remained as a consultant, basically? You still
I couldn't. I became too weak to... I was too weak to talk for 5 years. And I had to be shielded from every form of stress you can imagine. So I just was gone. Period. Nobody.
Well, this is actually a perfect opportunity to move into our client for today, because I know that these particular individuals have been very helpful in terms of your own recuperation and maintaining your peace of mind. So our client for anybody who's been following along from the beginning is, are dogs best friend? Because we know that dogs are man's best friend, and Howard, from the documentary I saw, he stops and he will pet every dog that he sees if he's allowed to. But do you think that the dogs feel the same way about other dogs that they feel about you, or do they treat other dogs the way that people treat dogs, those who like dogs, that is? How do we address this?
Well, dogs love the company of other dogs, and usually if they're given a choice between a human who wants to give them all the pets in the world and another dog, they'll pick another dog. But then there's
that's
the question.
That's an interesting observation. I never thought about that. Okay,
it's very true. Watch and you'll see.
I'm a dog guy. I've had dogs. That's totally true.
Probably because they'll sniff each other's butts, and most humans will not sniff a dog's butts. Well, at least hopefully they won't.
Well, it's more than that. Imagine that you're a human and you're locked indoors all day long by your owners, who are giraffes. And every time your owners, the giraffes, have their family over, it's other giraffes. When they have their friends over, it's other giraffes. And all day long, you are kept from the company of other humans. And then a couple of times a day, your owner puts a collar on you and puts you on a leash and takes you out And guess what? Other giraffes are out there walking their humans. So which are you going to be more interested in? The giraffes that you spend your whole day with, or the humans that you've been locked away from all the
I want to
time?
buy the film rights to this story. I like the sci-fi thing you've come up with. Be a good movie.
The giraffes keeping the humans.
Escape from the planet of the giraffes.
Yes, right. Yeah.
The giraffes took over the world.
But then the dogs have a problem. Once they've met each other and sniffed each other, then they have to determine who's on top and who's not. They have to determine a pecking order. And that's where the problems can come in. That's
We
where
kind
the
of do
one
that
dog
as
can,
humans.
yeah, where one dog can begin snarling at another. And you can have problems. Doesn't always happen. In fact, most of the time it doesn't happen. There usually isn't snarling. But all that chasing and playing that you see, the question is who's going to end up on his back and who's going to end up standing tall.
Right. So then maybe the dog isn't so much the dog's best friend in that case. But then
Well,
again,
it's
you know,
like
the
humans.
humans
I
are
mean,
messed up as
imagine-
well. So yeah.
Imagine you're meeting another human on the street, your giraffes are walking you, and you're all excited to see the other human. Your first step is to rush over, delighted to finally see another human being after all of these long-necked creatures stalking around you. And but after you've done your first introductory whatever it is, then it's a question of who one-ups whom, of who's going to be on top in this relationship. Humans do the same damn thing that dogs do.
Do you think that's true, Greg?
Well, not for me, because as I've established, I'm a Zeta male. So I could give a shit who's on top. Do I like hanging out with this person? Whatever.
So you're just going for all the belly scratches, is what you're saying. You just
Oh yeah.
pause
All my
up
friends,
for
all
everyone.
my friends scratch my belly. Kind of a prerequisite to be my friend.
Brendan, how do you feel about it?
I'm glad I live in Florida because I don't want to scratch Greg's belly.
Scratch my belly. Come on,
Nope.
Brendan.
No.
Come on. Take a flight.
I mean,
Yeah.
Brendan's kind of looking like a dog today because he's got a bandana around his neck.
Well, this is my, Saturdays are days I do a lot of running of errands. So rather than try to, it's funny when I watched your documentary, I was talking to my wife about it, Howard, and you had that list. Like these guys were spoofing on
yes.
the fact that you were spoofing on the fact that you wrote down all of those, all of your push-up numbers.
Right.
And
That one.
Yeah, I told him, I said, I have a spreadsheet. I don't have push-up numbers, but I have about 16 other things I track on a daily basis. I don't know. But anyway, you have that door thing. I don't want to remember a mask. So I put this on Saturdays because I go in and out and I don't think about it. And then if I get somewhere, I go, oh yeah, okay, I'm good to go.
Good.
So wait,
Yes.
so Brendan, I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. So you say
Oh,
you have like
God, no.
16 different things that you keep track of. What are two of those things that you keep track
His
of?
Pilates.
His
No,
Pilates? How many times he puts the mask up and down his face?
No, I've recently been tracking my water intake. Like I want to drink more water because I think that's important it feels like something easy to do that's healthy. That's one thing.
Like by the ounce or by the liter?
By the ounce.
Okay, so you're keeping track of the ounces of water you're drinking. All right,
Yeah.
how about the quality of the water? Do you check into
No.
that too? No.
No, I don't give
So
a
you
shit.
pH.
So it's
No.
not like you're not checking. Well, that's important. You need to look into the pH, Brendan. Otherwise, you could be getting
No.
very unhealthy. You could get chunky water, and that would be
Yeah.
bad.
Do you want me to answer the second thing I track, or do you want
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
What are the other 15 things? I'm curious.
Howard wants them all.
Yeah.
one of the things that I track that I found very interesting over the last 4 weeks is I track all the interactions with my wife. So
So she
Uh-huh.
want to hit you in the head again?
well, yeah, no, but that's a different subject. But in a given day, there's a certain amount of time that you spend with your wife, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, 4 hours, whatever it may be. And so I begin to track kind of on a scale rating from like 5 to 1, and then I kind of have a running average. So I don't know. It kind of helps me to sort of see patterns and things. So I
Some
think
days do you look at the list? Some days do you look at the
Yeah.
list and say, "Oh, I spent way too much time with my wife yesterday. I got to cut down tomorrow." Do you ever feel that way?
No, absolutely. It's the opposite. It was part of like trying to, because I'm a workaholic too. So it's about unplugging from work and actually spending time with my wife and kids because they're important.
So you're not like writing down like how many words you speak to her per day.
No, but I do have Grammarly, so I do track how many words that that Grammarly checks, and I have a entry on that.
I think the kerchiefs, something else is about wearing a kerchief. You're always ready to rob a stagecoach.
If I have to,
you're just ready.
It is Florida. If I have to rob a convenience store to survive, I'll do it.
Now, is that hat you're wearing, is that like it used to be a MAGA hat, but you rub the letters off of it, or?
No, it's a hat a friend of mine gave me, and it matched the shirt.
Just so you could fit in Florida is probably why you have that.
Yeah,
hat.
no, that's exactly.
You wouldn't be ostracized for being a non-Trump supporter.
Right. No, that's.
Oh, did you grow up with a dog as a kid? Did you always have dogs around the house? When you were a
No,
little boy?
we never had dogs, but my dad, I was 5 years old, and a dog, I was probably about 4, maybe even 3, and a dog licked my face out in front of my house. And I was terrified and started whimpering, and my dad said, don't worry, he's just kissing you. And since I didn't get any kisses from my mother or my father or anybody else, I discovered that dogs give you unconditional love, thanks to my dad, giving you the right perceptual framework with which to interpret this.
So did that began your love of dogs? Did you want to becoming a dog owner later in life, or you just decided not to trap them as the giraffe?
In my first marriage, we had a whole mess of dogs. 80 cats went through the house, which is another 80? Story. Yeah, we never had more than 8 at a time. But my wife was into rescuing feral cats when they dropped their kittens. And once they dropped their kittens, she would go knocking on the doors to find the backyard in which the kittens had been dropped. And she would grab all of the kittens and try to grab the mother, which wasn't easy with a feral cat, and drag them all home and get them all spayed, and then send my stepdaughter out on the street, who was this lovely blonde waif with kittens in her arms, to give them away. And it almost always worked.
That's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, that's nice.
But we had a great, big, giant, well, actually, one day, when my wife was taking her bicycle and going out on the street to bicycle to work, there was a creature on the top of the stoop. And it was impossible to determine what this animal was. And when she came back in the afternoon, this poor thing was still there, hairless, shivering, and she brought this thing inside.
Its name was Greg?
Its name was Shluppy, actually.
And it was a rat.
No, it turned out to be the biggest German Shepherd you've ever seen in your life.
Oh.
And it turned out that according to a guy whose brother was a purebred shepherd owner, or shepherd breeder, that it was a purebred German Shepherd. And it was the most wonderful, 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 wonderful dog I've ever had. Just fabulous. But no, I'm a public resource. I'm a public utility. In other words, I need to pet dogs, and there are some dogs who don't feel they're petted enough at home. And so my needs and their needs match each other perfectly.
Do you go out of your way to go to like animal shelters to give all of your services to all of the dogs that probably need it a lot?
No, I am too busy, and I have a very tight schedule. I have more to do than I can possibly do.
So that's actually a question that I wanted to lead into at some point, which is, are you still creating the grand unified theory? Is that, or is that done? Have you finally unified it?
No, it's not done. It's still evolving. I'm still getting it down to a tiny little space. But the big deal, what I've learned is this. Michio Kaku, the science TV personality. Yeah, well, he's at City University of New York, and he's a very well-known theoretical physicist and cosmologist. And Michio Kaku's got this new book out called The God Equation. And it's about how once upon a time, Newton came up with the laws of motion, and that was great, but it couldn't explain electromagnetism. And then 150 years later, Maxwell came up with the 4 equations that describe electromagnetism and unified all of it together, the laws of motion plus electromagnetism. But gravity has been eluding these equations for as long as equations have been applied to physics, which is just the last 350 years. And so the scientists at CERN, that great big particle collider in Switzerland, they're breaking things down to the smallest parts of the smallest parts in the hope of finishing this equation and adding gravity to it and creating the ultimate grand unified theory, what they call the grand unified theory of everything, the gut. Well, frankly, a grand unified theory that only describes what the smallest particles of particles do is not a grand unified theory of everything. It's a grand
Kind of
unified
a
theory
tiny
of almost
unified
nothing.
theory, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what I've been doing since I was 12 years old, and God knows how this assignment landed on my plate, but I've been assembling a cosmic timeline, a timeline that puts the Big Bang, the evolution of the first particles, the evolution of the first atoms, the evolution of the first galaxies, the first stars, the first planets, and the first life and poetry and all of it together on a grand timeline. And so instead of the guys at CERN are developing the ultimate microscope, breaking things down to their smallest parts. What I've been working on since I was 12 is the world's macroscope. It includes everything that ever was and everything that we know. And once you put all these things on a timeline, you begin to discover astonishing relationships. I mean, you discover that in something like 1500, the English East India Company was founded. In something like 1639, the British clockmakers were given a guild of their own for the very first time. And then in 1660 or so, Andrew Marvell writes a poem to his coy mistress. And he's trying to seduce a woman. And he's saying, would there but world enough on time, this coyness lady were no crime. It's dominated by time. Clocks have just become household items. And at another point in the poem, he says, nor would I love at lower rate. Rate has become important because you're lending money to organizations like the East India Company. And you get your money back at a certain rate if the ship you bet your money on comes back. Sometimes they don't, and you lose your money entirely.
So are you dealing mainly with like historically significant events, or are you taking the minutia that led up to those historic events to be, because that seems like a nearly impossible task, because everything?
Yeah, I've been doing it since I was 12.
When's the last time you saw a flea fart? It's like, where does that fall into?
The invention of the first equation is in 1570. Up until then, when people have talked about mathematics, they've talked about things you can do with pictures. It's called geometry. And there has been no mathematics as we know it today until 1570. And then equations are not adopted until about 1660, when Isaac Newton begins to use them. But if you look through his Principia, they're still sparse. There are very few equations, at least that I was able to find in there. And equations become the math, so much so that we think of math as equations. That's all math is, so far as we know. No, if we could invent a new thing called equations in 1570, what new things might there be just around the corner? New mathematical tools. So
right,
you get this really big picture when you lay everything out on a common timeline. Michelangelo creates his David in the 1500s. And David is very unlike anything that's come before in art, because the fact is that up until then, art has been used to terrify people about hell. So art has been about God's frying pans and his rotary
hunting buffalo
grills.
on a cabin, a cave.
Yeah, it's been scary stuff.
Yeah.
And the focus has been on the afterlife, not on the current life. And Michelangelo was turning the attention to the life we live right now in the physical world and away from heaven and hell. So in Andrew Marvell's poem, 130 years later, you see that same approach. It's all about the earthly life. There is no mention of Jesus, salvation, heaven, hell, any of that stuff.
So I'm assuming the beginning of your timeline is like the Big Bang. Is that?
That's it. Because when I was 12 years old, I had been reading 2 books a day under the desk since I was 10. It meant I read a book under the desk at school, then I came home and read another book. And I was doing miserably in school because I paid no attention. I wasn't the least bit interested.
Were
in
these
what my teachers
nonfiction
were
or
saying.
fiction books you were reading?
These were science fiction and nonfiction.
Okay.
And science nonfiction. And when I was 12, my parents decided to try to find a school in which I might fit a little bit better. And they found this school called the Park School of Buffalo, which John Dewey had helped found. And John Dewey was the philosopher who founded progressive education, which was based on his idea that you should let a kid follow his own curiosities.
I went to George Dewey High School, but completely different guy.
So my parents sent me for an interview with the headmaster. Now, you got to imagine this. There's this 12-year-old Pep. Now, admittedly, I had co-designed my first computer and had won some science fair awards at that point. I built my first Boolean algebra machine. I had been taken for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. And after an hour debating Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe, he came out and told my mom, you don't have to save for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics at any school he wants. So I had been tutored in outside the box scientific thinking by the head of research and development for the company that made the valves for the first plane that broke the sound barrier and the first plane that took humans to the edge of space. So
that's right, because you're working with Buzz Aldrin these days, right?
Yeah.
That's right. You and Brendan have a connection then.
Oh, really? How so?
I worked in the mid early 90s in a magazine called Final Frontier, which was not about Star Trek, which was about space exploration, NASA, space technology transfer. Leonard David, that name.
Oh, yes, Leonard is terrific.
Leonard David was our editor-in-chief. He's now at space.com. I was friends with him, and we were working on selling Buzz's book, and I was working in the editorial department. It was a small magazine, so I was editorial department and ad sales and in-house like merch kind of guy, and we were selling Buzz's book. So I got a chance to call and talk to Buzz many times, and a fantastic human being, often very grumpy, but a good guy all around.
Right. And a phone call with him is amazing. One day I was doing an interview for a film and my phone was buzzing, it was vibrating. And I knew it was my girlfriend. She had an instinct for interrupting in the most important of things.
Sure.
So I waited until the interview was over. I got out into the waiting room of the studio. I looked at my phone. It wasn't my girlfriend. It was Buzz. I called him. And by the time we got off the phone, it was 2 hours and 13 minutes later. So that's a phone call with Buzz.
Yeah, no, I miss those phone calls. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he is. So at any rate, so they sent me to this meeting with this inscrutable looking headmaster who's sitting in the shadows and trying to look very Sphinx-like and very imposing. And remember, I have my track record at school, my school grades have been absolutely abysmal. There's no reason he should want to take me into his school. And I make demands. I say, I'm 12. I say, we'll only come to your school on the following conditions. First of all, you have to teach me Russian because the Soviet Union is going to be an important country in the world. Now, 2 years later, Sputnik would be launched.
Second, I want to be carried on a litter throughout the halls.
No, the second one was, and I want you to reverse the order of your science courses. Right now, you teach biology first, chemistry second, and physics third. I want you to teach me physics first, because that's the story of the Big Bang and the origin of the first particles and the first atoms. I want you to teach me chemistry next, because that's what happens when atoms get together in big agglomerations. I want you to teach me biology next, because that's when those big agglomerations of molecules invent life. I want you to teach me anthropology after that, so I get to see the primitive roots of human societies. And then I want you to teach me history, because that's what happens after societies coalesce.
I wish I had been that smart back in the day. I would have wanted that order too, but I never would even had the thought.
I was going to say,
I put it in that order, but I love that.
That is absolutely the right sequence of how you would teach those things, for sure.
So in other words, I'm laying them out as a common story. And humans make sense of things with stories. So I've been working on this timeline ever since I was 12 years old. What inspired me, I have no idea. I mean, my girlfriend and I just went back and read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy.
I was just thinking about the Foundation series in terms of this because it totally fits the whole concept of psychohistory and what you're doing. So is that kind of what you're attempting to emulate? Or I mean, but obviously it's your own things.
Well, to a certain extent. Remember, I tell people if they ask me, my field is mass behavior. It's only one of my fields, but mass behavior, from the mass behavior of quarks to the mass behavior of human beings. And where does that idea come from? The emphasis on human mass behavior comes from the Foundation trilogy. So that influence I've been able to track down. But where I got this idea of a cosmic timeline, I have no idea. But I've been working on it ever since.
And did you ever get to meet Asimov?
No, I didn't. And it's too bad.
Yeah, I would love to.
I was watching an interview of his just recently, actually, that he had done on David Letterman back in like 1985, where he totally predicted YouTube.
Astonishing.
He was talking about there's going to come a time, but he was saying it was going to be based upon like a fiber optics or lasers, that everyone would have their own television channel.
Right.
It was like almost his exact words, and I'm like, Bing, this is,
wow, that was
a long time before YouTube. It was like 85, I think.
85 still. That's a lot of time before YouTube.
That was when
he was able to predict a few
started.
things. Right. Well, computers that started before that, but still, that was quite the prediction to make, is that he could see that potentially happening, but he was also a definite scientist as well. He worked both ends. But it's just ironic you bring it up, because I just recently started getting revitalized into the Foundation books, because I found out that Apple TV is doing a show based upon the Foundation books. And I just came across a trailer for it. I'm like, what? They're doing, how's that going to come across?
Right.
And I went, God, I totally forgot about this. So I just actually bought all the Foundation books on Audible.
All 7?
No, just the first 4. Because apparently 2 of them are read by a guy who doesn't do a very good job. So I was like, all right, well, I'll just do these.
Right.
But anyway,
well,
I just love those books. I'm glad to see that they're doing a show, but it'll probably get ruined. The book probably will not be given justice because, it's the nature.
It's an easy thing to ruin on television, because it skips from one generation to another, and it's
especially that storyline. Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah,
it's nuts.
And it's constantly introducing new characters.
Yeah.
So if you're going to get attached to characters, they're going to have to pick a little coterie of characters.
I think they're keeping like Harry Seldon as like the tying framework to it.
Right.
Like probably videos or things that people see. And they have a pretty decent actor who's playing him too. They got Jared Harris, who was the son of Richard Harris.
Right.
He was in Mad Men. He's been in the show The Expanse, which is like, in my opinion, the best hard science fiction show I've seen probably in 20, 30 years.
I'm curious, with all your studies in this timeline, are you optimistic about humanity's future or pessimistic with everything you've learned?
I'm absolutely optimistic. We have to grab hold of something, and that is the simple fact that this planet is the mother of climate catastrophe. This planet has been cycling up and down in temperatures ever since it began, and it's been cycling up and down enormously. Once or twice in the history of this planet, we've had ice ball Earths, where the ice has been over half a mile thick at the equator. We've also
can't wait for that.
And we've also had global warmings where the poles have been semi-tropical, or at least have been temperate, and dinosaurs have lived there, plus all the foliage it takes to feed dinosaurs. So one way or the other, we can do all we want to take out the man-made greenhouse gases, and we should. But we should for a reason that's not obvious. Taking out the greenhouse gases is not going to return the Earth to a petting zoo. It has never been a petting zoo. This has been a poison pill of stone from the very beginning, and life has gotten as far as it could, or as it has, by taking poison after poison and turning it into a piston in the engines of life.
You're filled with metaphors, aren't you?
So the trick is, we are doom riders and catastrophe tamers. That's been our gift. We've already made it through 10 global warmings, and we've made it through something like 6 major Earth ice ages.
Those are actually our
Um,
superhero names. Brendan is Catastrophe Tamer. Greg is Doom Rider. I'm just the and
so
That's
between
pretty
them.
cool. But do you think humanity? I know the Earth will survive, but like the dinosaurs didn't survive these changes. Do you
Some of
think
them
we
did.
will? Some of
we're
them?
about to go multiplanetary. If environmental extremists don't stop that, because they're against technology. I mean, the real extremists, not the mainstream environmentalists, the extremists. I think we as humans are going to survive. We can wish ourselves into Armageddon for all we're worth, and we've been doing that since the 1960s, when science fiction became dystopian completely. We've been wishing ourselves into the end of humanity, but the Chinese are not doing that. I'm a co-founder and co-chair of the Asian Space Technology Summit. The Chinese are profoundly hopeful about the future, astonishingly hopeful about the future. So are the Malaysians, so are the Vietnamese. We see ourselves as being at the end of our civilization. That's ridiculous. 250 years, the end of a civilization. Rome lasted 1400 years. And it's the example we use of the rise and fall of a civilization, 1400 years. And we think we're over and out after 250. Give me a break. If we really want the world to be autocratic, authoritarian, if we want to eliminate freedom of speech and the things that we believe in, and pluralism and tolerance, then by all means, let the Chinese take over the planet. And you'll have the autocratic, dictatorial, totalitarian utopia of your dreams. But if you believe...
Of your dreams.
Yeah.
Happy days.
Yeah, but if you believe in freedom of speech, if you believe in democracy, if you believe in pluralism, then it's your job to stand up for the civilization and realize this is the first civilization in the history of mankind to invent the end of slavery. Every civilization has had slavery. Only we have invented the end of slavery. This is the first civilization in the history of mankind to recognize species diversity and to try to protect it. The very first.
So we're better friends than dogs are, just to go back to our client, because we've ignored our client for a while.
Yes, well, so the deal is, plus, if you've been born in 1850, your expected lifespan would have been 1/2 of what it is today, 40 years less than it is today. If you had been given a Stanford Binet IQ test, if you've been a teenager in 1916, when the first Stanford Binet IQ test was administered, and then you gave that test to 100 random kids off the street today, the kids who we were told have been dumbed down and shallowed by Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, those kids off the street today would register as marginal geniuses on a Stanford Binet IQ test from 1916, because the average IQ has gone up by 35 points in the United States. If you looked at your rate of death at the hands of your fellow human beings, if you had been living in one of those wonderful indigenous tribes that lives at harmony, at peace with nature and in harmony with its fellow human beings, your odds of dying a death at the hands of a fellow human being would have been 10 times what they are today. Modern Western civilization has increased the peace in the world by a factor of 10, despite the bloody 20th century, which was nothing compared to the bloodiness of indigenous tribes. It has increased the average IQ by 35 points. It has increased the average lifespan by 40 years. And it has done this for what we consider to be the most poor and oppressed among us. There was a guy in England in the 1800s who was fabulously rich and fabulously powerful. And he was a technophile. He loved technology. So he had all the major technologies, the new cutting edge technologies from all over the world shipped to London so he could see them. And he built a special building in which to display them. And he dictated that it would be built of narrow rods of steel with lots and lots of glass. It was called the Crystal Palace. And the gathering of all these technologies was the Great Exposition of 1851. Well, this guy who had all this power came down with a stomach ailment at the age of 42 and died. He was Prince Albert. His wife's name was Queen Victoria. If he had come down, I had a friend who was a homeless guy. And my homeless friend, anytime he came up with an ailment like this, just walked down the street to the local hospital and into the emergency room, and they gave him an antibiotic. So my friend, the homeless man, lived to the age of 72. Prince Albert died at 42. That's a 30-year difference. And the homeless guy, my homeless friend, also had a cell phone and a bicycle. Things that Prince Albert could not even dream of. So,
and now he's just in a can.
Yes. So Western civilization has done these astonishments for our fellow human beings. And if you want to see those stop, then hey, shoot our civilization in the head. But if you don't recognize these things, you have no right to do that. I mean, we're even 4 inches taller than we were in 1900.
I love technology myself. But
I don't think my mother believes that. She's 5'2".
My fear is that
yeah.
My fear is that humanity isn't wise enough to know what to do with this technology. Like, it's great on some levels, but on some levels we could destroy ourselves with it because we don't have the wisdom, hasn't caught up to our technological smartypantsness.
Okay, my book.
Is that the technical term, Greg? Smartypantsness?
Yes.
So I have this book called The Genius of the Beast, a radical revision of capitalism. It says the Western system, ever since 1760, has operated on a balance between 3 elements. Element number 1 is private industry. Element number 2 is government that provides the infrastructure without which private industry cannot function. And element number 3 is the protest industry, which started around 1760 to 1780 as an anti-slavery movement and delivered the first anti-slavery legislation in a very short amount of time, by 1804 in England. We've had a protest movement now for as long as we've had an industrial revolution. And that protest movement has been keeping us on our toes about our relationship to the environment, the need for maintaining other species, making sure that those species survive, et cetera. And it's through the balance between these 3 elements that the Western system has its genius. It's not through any one individual human who is a spokesman for every conceivable position. No, it's the opposition of elements. It's like when you're riding a bicycle. If you lean too far over to the right, you end up falling on your right shoulder.
Or it's like checks and balances, like in the
government. Checks and balances.
System of checks and balances.
Could you define what those 3 elements are again? I think I missed it.
Okay, it's private industry.
Okay.
The government,
mm-hmm.
and the protest industry.
Okay. So that's what
I
keeps
better head out for
capitalism moving.
I better head out for my afternoon walk before the sun.
Yes, I was going to say,
utterly.
We've taken up so much of your time. We greatly appreciate it. We certainly would love to have you back again if you're willing to jabber on with us.
Yes, I'm absolutely willing. Yes.
All right, great.
So we'll do episode number 2 on a future occasion.
Excellent.
Sometime in the future.
I have only one question. It's somewhat political, but let me ask it. Mayor of New York, who do you like?
Andrew Yang.
I knew it.
Is that the poster that you removed? Because he had the Yang. Yeah, there it is. Andrew Yang poster in Brendan's back.
Terrific. Excellent. Well, I never heard of him. And then Joe Rogan one day said, what do you think of Andrew Yang? And I had no idea. I'd never heard of him before.
Were you on Joe Rogan's show?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
This is when I was on Joe's show.
Okay.
Brendan's in the Yang gang, like you.
It was like a 3-hour interview or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Extraordinary.
That's amazing. Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I figured you were, just given everything you just went through. He's a Yang ganger. I knew it.
Well, he and I were in a film together called The Culture High. So it was Richard Branson, Joe Rogan, me, and Snoop Dogg.
Makes sense.
So that's how we got introduced.
I want to thank our guest today, Howard Bloom, the author, former PR whiz king. That didn't even make any sense. Anyway,
whiz king,
the king of whiz. All right.
I just see cheese whiz dripping off of a
I prefer
crown.
that than the other connotation. Anyway, we greatly appreciate you coming on today on the law offices Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker.
You've left the offices of Quibble, Squabble, and Bicker. It's over. It's over. It's time for you to go home. It's over. It's over. Go away now.